This is a reading from Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling's lectures in Berlin, titled The Grounding of Positive Philosophy. The first lecture is titled On Philosophy. It would seem neither improper nor undesirable if, before the exposition of the particular subject of the lecture that I now have the occasion to give, that I put forward a general word about philosophy as such. There is perhaps not one among you who has not come here with some type of idea, or at least a presentiment, of what philosophy is. Here, even the beginner will say, here those questions will be answered for me which, in all other sciences, there is no answer, and that sooner or later, but always inevitably, disturb every upright spirit. Here that veil will be removed that until now has hidden from me. Not particular objects, but this entirety itself, of which I feel a part, and of which the more I sought to learn of its particulars became all the more unfathomable. Here no doubt will be won those eminent convictions that maintain human consciousness aright, without which life would have no purpose and would thus be deprived of all dignity and independence. All the sciences with which I have previously concerned myself are based on presuppositions that, in themselves, are not justified. The mathematical disciplines progress within themselves without significant scandal, but mathematics does not comprehend itself, since it provides no account of itself or of its own possibility, and as soon as it wanted to ground itself, it would with that very attempt go beyond itself and abandon the basis on which it alone can achieve its results. Besides mathematics, I have until now primarily concerned myself with the study of classical languages. I am indebted to this study for that formal exercise of the spirit that, more than any abstract logic or rhetoric, puts me in the proper state of mind to notice and to express the most subtle gradations or distinctions of any thought. I am indebted to this study for the priceless advantage of always being able to inhale directly from the great works of antiquity that spirit from which they are inspired, to elevate and to refresh my soul. Yet, the more deeply I grasped and examined the construction of these original languages, the more I felt the need to penetrate to the very nature of this wonderful instrument itself, which, when appropriately used, expresses thoughts with infallible certainty, and regarding sentiment, is delicate enough to reproduce its quietest breath, yet strong enough to reproduce the raging storm of the most vehement passions. Where does language come from? How was it that it came into being for humanity? Where does this power come from, which this instrument creates not before its employment, but immediately in the employment itself? A power that I brandish not with hands or external organs, but directly with the spirit itself, within which I truly dwell, which animates me, and within which I move freely and with no resistance. Next, I directed my attention to the external objects of nature around me. I acquainted myself with the fundamental propositions of physics, acquired the elementary ideas and concepts of the most general natural phenomena. I became familiar with the laws of gravity, of pressure, of kinetics, and I observed the effects of light, of heat, of magnetism, and of electricity. I listened to explanations of these phenomena as well. Some of these phenomena, like gravity, were attributed to immaterial causes. Others were attributed to, as one says, certain subtle or imponderable substances. Still, if I go so far as to grant that these substances and forces actually explain these phenomena, a position about which I hardly feel convinced in every regard, there is always a question that remains. From where do these substances and forces themselves derive, and for what purpose? What type of necessity do they have to exist? And why are there such things? I will grant that light consists of or is produced by the vibration of the ether. But what of the ether itself that fills outer space? What cause do I know to ascribe for its existence? It seems to me something so contingent that I cannot even comprehend it, and thus cannot accept as actually explained any phenomenon that depends on it. I have also looked into natural history, and if this inexhaustible manifold of colors, forms, and shapes in which organic nature appears to play already aroused my youthful sensibilities, and if I then later believed that I had detected a subtle law that for once would guide my spirit through this labyrinth, showing me the path of generative nature itself, there nevertheless remained for me always an unanswered question: why are there such beings at all? Why are there plants? Why animals? One answers me: they are but steps over which nature ascends in order to arrive at humanity. Thus, in humanity, I shall find the answer to all questions, the solution to all riddles, and for this very reason, I am inclined to agree with those who for ages have claimed the sole object of the final science that answers all questions, the sole object of philosophy, is man. But if man is undoubtedly the culmination, and to this extent the goal of all creation and becoming, am I therefore entitled then and there to proclaim him to be its ultimate purpose as well? Would I be justified in doing this if I knew how to specify what that being, which permeates every level of becoming as its efficient cause, had intended for him? Am I, however, capable of specifying this? I could conceive of that being, perhaps, as something that, initially blind, struggles through every level of becoming toward consciousness, and humanity would then arise precisely at that moment, at that point in which this previously blind nature would reach self-consciousness. But this cannot be, since our self-consciousness is not at all the consciousness of that nature that permeates everything. It is just our consciousness, and hardly encompasses within itself a science of becoming applicable to all things. This universal becoming remains just as foreign and opaque to us as if it had never had a bearing on us at all. Therefore, if this becoming has achieved any kind of purpose, it is achieved only through humanity, but not for humanity. For the consciousness of man does not equal the consciousness of nature. But, one answers, of course the ultimate and highest purpose does not lie in the human faculty of cognition, since if nature is impenetrable to man, conversely, man is foreign to a nature that indeed continues beyond him and his works, and thus for which he has no significance. The reason for this lies precisely in the fact that man has separated himself from nature, and in the fact that, as experience shows, man was by no means merely destined to be the goal or culmination of a process independent of him, but was rather destined to be himself the originator and creator of a new process, of a second world that would lift itself above the first. The true purpose of man lies in what he, through the freedom of his will, should be in this different world. man was the goal of nature only to the extent that he was destined to sublate nature within himself, to continue beyond nature, and to begin for himself a new chain of events. But far from hoping to be able to arrive at the true reason for the world through this deferment of the ultimate purpose, this freedom of the will which I have conceded to man and from which I now should expect the solution of this great riddle, itself leads to a new one, that indeed is the greatest of all riddles, and plunges man into an even deeper, if possible, ignorance than that in which he previously found himself with respect to only nature. For when I consider the actions and consequences of this freedom in general, and I had also taken at least a general look at history before I turned to the study of philosophy, this world of history presents such a dreary spectacle that I completely despair of there being no purpose and therefore no true reason for the world. For if every other creature of nature, in its place or at its stage, is that which it should be and therefore fulfills its purpose, then so much the more is man, since he can become what he should be only with consciousness and freedom, as long as he remains unconscious of his purpose and is swept along by this tremendous and never-ceasing movement we call history, toward a goal of which he is not aware, he is himself purposeless. And since he should be the purpose of everything else, then through him everything else again becomes purposeless. All of nature toils and is engaged in unceasing labor. Man, for his part, also does not rest. And it is, as an old book says, although everything under the sun is so full of toil and labor, one nonetheless does not see that anything is improved, or that something is truly accomplished in which one might truly believe. A generation passes away, and another arises to itself again, passes away. In vain we expect that something new will happen in which this turmoil will finally find its goal. Everything that happens only so that something else again can happen, which itself in turn becomes the past to something else. Ultimately, everything happens in vain, and there is in every deed, in all the toil and labor of man himself, nothing but vanity. Everything is vain, for vanity is everything that lacks a true purpose. Thus, far from man and his endeavors making the world comprehensible, it is man himself that is the most incomprehensible, and who inexorably drives me to the belief in the wretchedness of all being, a belief that makes itself known in so many bitter pronouncements from both ancient and recent times. It is precisely man that drives me to the final desperate question: why is there anything at all? Why is there not nothing? That there should be a science that responds to these questions, which would snatch us from this despair, is unquestionably a compelling, indeed a necessary longing, a longing not of this or that individual person, but of human nature itself. What other science should it be that is capable of this, if not philosophy? For all other sciences known by man, invented or developed by him, each has its specific task, and none responds to this final and most universal question. So there will be no doubt about this. Philosophy is in itself, and at all times, the most longed for of sciences, since through it all other knowledge receives both its first, highest reference and its final support. If I cannot answer this final question, then for me everything else sinks into the abyss of a bottomless void. These questions, however, are not now advanced for the first time, and the need for philosophy has not arisen only in our age. What Horace says regarding heroes applies to those who search for wisdom as well. Philosophical spirits have wandered not only under the plane trees of the Lysis, but also under the palms along the Ganges and the Nile, even if no perceptible or definitive word, but at most a vague sound, has reached us. And even the earlier as well as the later philosophers of Greece, Pythagoras as well as Plato, were familiar with questions on account of which they deemed it worth the trouble to travel to the ends of the known world to secure their answers, as, for example, the dying Socrates challenged his students to ask even the barbarians about wisdom. And how many and what momentous centuries have in the meantime passed over the human spirit? How this wisdom was first transplanted through Christendom to Europe, and then in more recent times through the virtually unrestricted expansion of world relations, how the Orient and the Occident are not merely coming into contact with one another, but are being compelled, as it were, to fuse into one and the same consciousness, into one consciousness that should for this reason alone be expanded into a world consciousness. How much has the German spirit alone achieved and accomplished for philosophy from the Middle Ages until now? Yet we must nonetheless confess that there was perhaps never before now a time in which a philosophy that would actually take hold of the great issues, not merely treat them with formulas, was more urgently and universally needed, and perhaps no other time when we have been driven farther away from philosophy's proper goal. If for many years human affairs have maintained a certain uniform course, then they become convictions necessary for life that, quite independent of philosophy, acquire their validity precisely through their necessity, a type of sweet habit. In such times, one does not easily think of an investigation of these principles, and even if these long-held standards and doctrines have long since inevitably grown lax, and indeed have fundamentally lost their original force, precisely such a fact is handled as a mystery. For fear of destroying the cozy situation, one avoids looking this fact in the face or declaring that the moral and spiritual powers that still hold the world together, albeit in a merely habitual sense, have long since been undermined by the advance of science. Such a situation can often last so unbelievably long because precisely that which was untenable in the earlier beliefs, according to the previous concepts, is so obvious that the more powerful minds do not find it worth the trouble to expose this, and instead leave the business to those mostly powerless minds, incapable of doing anything on their own, to publicly declare what for every profound observer has long since ceased to be a mystery, namely, that there is no place for these truths, considered as unassailable, in the consciousness of the present age. There then arises most often a great clamor, not so much about the matter at hand, which one has long since been unable to hide and now cannot deny as well, as about the unseemly audacity with which the matter is proclaimed. The more far-sighted, however, will recognize in all this only an actual need, the need to become aware in a new way of what the principles that in a new way of the principles that hold human life together. Not the truths, but the consciousness in which, as one says, they can no longer find a place, is that which is obsolete and should therefore make room for a different, expanded consciousness. But the transition to this new consciousness cannot happen without a disruption, indeed without a momentary nullification of the earlier condition. In this general breakdown, there will be for quite some time nothing that is secure, to which one could subscribe, and on which one could build. The beautiful and enchanted illusions of an age gone by vanish before the merciless truth. Truth, pure truth, is what one demands and still seeks in all relations, in all the institutions of life, and one can only rejoice when a time comes in which war is openly declared on every lie, every deception, where as a principle It is proclaimed that what is desired is truth at any price, even the most painful. For more than the half-century since Kant's critique of pure reason, the German spirit in particular has embarked upon a methodical examination of the foundation of all knowledge, indeed of all the basic elements of human existence and life itself. Since then, it has fought a fight the likes of which has never been fought with the same persistence, in constantly changing venues, or with such unrelenting ardor. And far from regretting this, one would like to call out to the Germans to hold out in this fight and not let up until the great prize is won. For the more lurid one may portray the threatening phenomenon of our age, the discord, the disagreement and dissolution, the more certain it becomes that the truly learned will see in all this the portents of a new creation, of a magnificent and enduring restoration, which of course would not be possible without the excruciating pains of labor, and the ruthless destruction of all that has become corrupt, fragile, and worn out that must precede it. Nevertheless, there must be an end to this battle, since there cannot be, as some imagine, an endless, that is, purposeless and meaningless progress. Humanity does not advance on into infinity. Humanity has a goal. There is, therefore, a point to be expected where the struggle for knowledge achieves its long-sought aim, where the millennia-long unrest of the human spirit comes to its rest, where man finally takes hold of the proper organism of his knowledge and learning, where the spirit of universal mediation pours forth like a balm over all the previously disparate and mutually exclusive elements of human learning, healing all the wounds that the human spirit in its zealous struggle for light and truth inflicts on itself, and from which our age still partially bleeds. But this would be too much. One could, for instance, object to our last remarks, to expect of philosophy, if through it one considers a restoration of this age as possible, since on the contrary philosophy itself has fallen into contempt, and that widespread interest, that enthusiasm for philosophy which one knew in earlier times is no longer apparent. It may well be that over a long period of time, and benefited by accidental circumstances, a way of doing philosophy has made itself credible that conveyed to some honorable men a certain aversion to philosophy. And perhaps an entire class of esteemed scholars who come from such an age believe, and have made no secret of this, that they can do away with all philosophy. In this case, of course, when pure historical knowledge is not combined with a sense for the ancient classics, and instead steps in as its replacement, the lack of a more profound education will soon become perceptible. However, if I see in philosophy the means for healing the fragmentation of our time, then I do not thereby mean a feeble philosophy that is a mere artifact. I mean a robust philosophy of the type that can measure up to life, and that, far from feeling powerless in the face of life and its awesome reality, or being confined to the miserable business of only negation and destruction, takes its vitality from reality itself, and for this very reason brings forth something that is again efficacious and enduring. Still, perhaps one says, it is not at all the task of science, and thus not that of philosophy, to bring the shrill discord of this age back into harmony. Would not the healing and reconciliation of our age be expected more truly from poetry? Yet history shows us well that an exuberant age, contented and satisfied with itself, pours itself into poetry and proclaims that poetry is, as it were, the natural product of an era that has appeased all its essential interests. On the other hand, however, history shows us no example of an age that deeply divided, confused, and doubtful of itself, has reconciled and healed itself through poetry. Secrets, says Friedrich Schiller, are for the happy. Indeed, one could say that poetry is for the happy. Yet, where are those who are happy in an age that is at odds with its past and present, that cannot find the breakthrough to a different age and to a true future? If an actual poet is found in such an age, he will be of the type that knows how to gather all the dissonance of the times into his spirit and combine them into an elaborate but supremely subjective totality, like Lord Byron. Lesser spirits will have to reach for frightful and even abominable subjects, so that, in contrast to reality, poetry will still appear to be something. I do not, however, really need to speak about this. From what one hears as far as poetry is concerned, the judgment of our age, or as far as Germany is concerned, has already been pronounced by another person, and indeed by the type who does not think much of philosophy, but who expects a fresh and healthy poetry only as the result of political upheaval. Now, this may well remain his opinion, into which I have no cause to go. I would, however, like to throw out the general question: how can one who pays no attention to such an essential element of German literature as philosophy credit himself with the ability to presage the future of German literature? For philosophy has penetrated so deeply into all the affairs of this age, and into literature in particular, it has acquired such a deep and internal bearing on poetry, that from now on, or at least for the moment, the destiny of both can only be a common one. Just as in earlier times poetry preceded philosophy, Goethe in particular had a truly prophetic relation to this, so now a revitalized philosophy is destined to bring about a new age of poetry, if only because it returns to poetry its necessary foundation, namely those momentous themes in which our age has lost faith, because it has long since lost all understanding for such matters. To be sure, a decent teacher of philosophy does not first anticipate objections to the intended effects of philosophy from others. It is his duty, once he has shown the edifying side of philosophy, to reveal the dismal and offensive side of it as well, so that no one deceives himself. And but a glimpse into its recent history provides adequate material for melancholy reflections on philosophy. This is because until now there has been no way to philosophize, or, as one otherwise says, none of the different philosophical systems have been able to survive over the course of time. I contend that it is also the duty of the teacher to reveal this side of philosophy, which repulses more than it attracts. For whoever considers how many people have shipwrecked on this rocky sea, how some with no vocation for philosophy have consumed the best years of their life, emptying their very soul into the fruitless and foolish pursuit of philosophy, who, without mentioning the desolate halls of prehistoric schools of wisdom, wander among the weather-beaten tombstones of former doctrinal systems whoever notices, closer to our age. How scholasticism, which remained throughout the entire Middle Ages in possession of an almost exclusive domination, and was still favored by the leaders and teachers of both churches in the time of the Reformation, and how in the 17th century, with no great resistance, it was suddenly and so completely defeated, if not in the schools then, nonetheless in popular opinion by Descartes, who because of his work, however, was still too immature to be called philosophy, caused one to become ungrateful to all philosophy. And it required nothing less than the entire stature of a Leibniz to partially restore philosophy's honor. Whoever considers how no less than the brilliant Leibnizian system, in the form provided it by Christian Wolff, dominated the German schools for quite some time, yet had nonetheless all but disappeared, and counted only a handful of scattered followers when Kant's critique of pure reason systematically put an end to it, or even how it was earlier forced to capitulate to a shallow popular philosophy lacking foundational principles and a guiding star. Whoever considers how, again, the last philosophy mentioned, the so-called critical philosophy, which for a long time enjoyed a nearly unlimited, one could even say tyrannical stature, and how these days it is scarcely known and still less understood by many who glorify philosophical studies and knowledge, and how it has in particular lost any influence on all the great questions of life. Whoever considers how the dynamic Fichte, the founder of transcendental idealism, whose appearance worked like a bolt of lightning, who for a moment more or less inverted the polarities of thought, but sadly, like a bolt of lightning, again disappeared, and how in the contemporary consciousness of the German people, the site could still scarcely be found on which he then constructed his system, so that one would find it difficult to make clear to his successors the fundamental ideas of his doctrine. Whoever then notices how, after a period of exhilarating activity, where the successful sublation of the antithesis between the real and the ideal world appeared to abolish all the limitations of previous knowledge, so that one law led through the world of nature and mind, and how in those days nature itself also appeared to adapt to this new knowledge through a series of brilliant and illuminating discoveries that followed the first observations of galvanism, as when, to use an expression of Goethe, a true heavenly knowledge appeared to descend. Whoever then notices how after such an era of a new darkness nonetheless follows, and what began great ended small. Whoever observes and considers all of this, truly, may well be filled with melancholy at the vanity of all human struggle for that highest knowledge that is demanded by philosophy. He may well find only a profound, if bitter, truth in those words that Goethe put in the mouth of the negative spirit in his Faust. Quote, "Oh, believe me, who for many thousand years have chewed upon this hard repast, that from the cradle to the grave no human could the old sourdough digest. Believe me also, this whole universe has only for a God been fabricated. He finds himself in an eternal glory, but us he's brought to darkness unabated, and you but one brief day has allocated." This diversity, this alternation of systems, not merely different from each other, but also opposed to each other, is a phenomenon that in any case indicates a quite distinctive nature of philosophy. And if we do not avoid recognizing this nature completely, precisely this phenomenon must be brought into our consideration, and where possible it must be comprehended from the nature of philosophy itself. One cannot avoid this diversity of philosophical systems by somehow saying that every philosophy is nonetheless still philosophy, just as every type of fruit is fruit. And how amazing would it be if someone would reject grapes or some other type of fruit because, although he craved only fruit, he did not crave this fruit. I do not believe that the objection, which takes the diversity of systems in philosophy as proof against philosophy itself, allows itself to be repulsed with merely this simile. To begin with it is not compelling that he who craves fruit must for that very reason accept any type. For if along these lines one offered him, for example, a wild pear, or so-called Hirlinge, he would be justified in saying that that is not fruit, since he had asked for fruit, namely something edible. Just as one with a thirst who craves water would not be obliged to drink nitric acid, since he craves something drinkable, not something that is just physically or mechanically drinkable, a potile, but rather something that to his taste is drinkable, that is, a potable. Second, it is just not compelling that we have a craving for philosophy in general. This would be like those fathers or guardians who direct their wards at the university to study philosophy, regardless of which kind, since after all it belongs to a proper education to allow to also know something about philosophy, or at the very least to receive some practice in logical and dialectical argumentation, so that, as one says, the mind will in general be put in order. Everyone, however, wants to know something about philosophy. For example, one who acts like he has a contempt for philosophy would probably take no offense if one said to him that he does not know how to compose a march or Latin verse, but would nonetheless find it highly offensive if one were to tell him that he does not have a philosophical mind. But if it be allowed for one to say such a thing, if someone did not want or intend to speak simply about philosophy in general, but to present the philosophy that is, and thus also endures, such a person would be the most inclined to let all previous developments have a just hearing, since they all must find their goal in the true philosophy. Such a person would feel the greatest reluctance to arouse the opinion that those attending his lectures should be prepared exclusively for some one system, and should be intentionally left in ignorance about all the other standpoints that lie outside that position, or should only be told of them in a partisan manner. Nothing could more enrage a youthful and fiery sensibility burning for the truth than the intention of a teacher to prepare his audience for some one special or particular system, wishing in this way to emasculate them by underhandedly removing the freedom of inquiry. Consequently, I have prefaced all my other lectures on philosophy with a genetic exposition of the systems of philosophy. Genetic, not generic. That have arisen since Descartes until recent times. Recently, there has been a profusion of such expositions written and presented, in which partisan intentions unfortunately stand out all too shrilly. For unfortunately, in some circles, philosophy has gradually become a partisan issue, whereby it has nothing to do with truth, but only with the preservation of an opinion. In this lecture series, I will restrict myself by beginning with Kant, or, more accurately speaking, with the old metaphysics that serves as the foundation of the Kantian philosophy. This old metaphysics was not a system in the sense that one speaks of systems since Descartes, but just as in Germany, for example, one speaks of a common German law, so too was the former metaphysics, to a certain degree, the common German philosophy predominant in the schools. This was a metaphysics that continued to hold its ground even after the appearance of these systems, since the entire system, for example, the Cartesian, was never incorporated into the common philosophy, but rather, at most, into their individual components. For this reason, I will begin with the old metaphysics, in order to show how, as the result of a necessary development, philosophy had to reach the point that it, just as its negative and positive facets distinguished themselves, would also realize that in the joining of these two facets, it would finally discover its complete and altogether satisfying conclusion. You see the point already touched on in an earlier lecture, where it dealt with the presentation of the positive philosophy itself, which I again pick up here, in order to ground it and expound on it still further. Yet since this time, the negative or rational philosophy will only be spoken of according to its general propositions, ideas, and methods, without itself being explicated, I will attempt for this purpose a different derivation of this science that for some of you will perhaps be more comprehensible.